So the work that I am presenting today, Space, Gender, and Sexuality in the Context of Nighttime Leisure in the City of Porto, is based on my research of my master thesis, which was done under the guidance of Professor Alicia. And yes, this investigation seeks to explore the relationship between space, gender, and sexuality, which we try to understand through, first, the practices, sociabilities, norms, and interactions involved in the clubbing experience, and secondly, the relevant articulation of three dimensions: the body, the emotions, and the identity that construct the space type of clubbing, as well as the way in which these are conditioned by this. So we choose to talk about queer women and certain gender minorities because in studies on LGBTQI+ teams, and specifically in relation to nightlife, it's more often talked about cisgender gay men whose experiences are not representative of those of all LGBTQI+ individuals. So there is double risk of homogenization of the experiences as well as risk of invisibilization. So some of the participants who took part in this research, which initially focused on queer women, have a gender identity other than that of women. So to be very specific, here we talk about queer non-men, and that includes cis and trans women, non-binary, agender, and gender-fluid people that aren't heterosexual. Also here, we do not simply use the word queer as an umbrella term that includes all LGBTQI+ identities, but as something that seeks to question the seemingly stable relationship between sex, gender, sexual desire, and sexual practice. So the specific questions that structure the investigations are: what is the role of the body in the clubbing experience? What are the emotions involved in the space-time of clubbing? What is the place of identity in nightlife, and what role does it play in the identity construction of queer women and non-binary people? What are the different dynamics of reproduction and resistance between the space-time of clubbing, more generally of nightlife, and the urban daytime space? So in regards to the theoretical framing, I will not go into great details about the contributions that have helped to think, structure, and guide this investigation, and I will simply and very briefly review some key authors and ideas. So firstly, in thinking about gender and sexuality, the investigation is mainly based on the contributions of Michel Foucault and Judith Butler. So Foucault thinks of sexuality as a powerful device for disciplining bodies, and that allows us to think about how power relations are constituted. Then Butler, who is heavily influenced by Foucault, allows us to think of issues of gender, sexuality, identity, and the materialities of body through concepts such as the heterosexual imperative and the abjection of bodies. So these approaches all allow us to think about issues of power as well as resistance. Then, in order to think about urban space and nighttime leisure, we try to go beyond the vision of space whose sole purpose is to contain, which would constitute only a neutral structure independent of any social dimension. So Henri Lefebvre allows us to think of space as a complex social construction, and he underlies the contradiction of space, its conflict, and its political character as well. Michel de Certeau identifies forms of subversion of the established order, and he thinks in terms of tactics and daily negotiation of space. Then here we also use Claudia Rodriguez's doctoral thesis, which is a long research work on the party district in the city of Porto. And that work shows us that nighttime leisure is a complex space-time that and deals with issues such as emancipation, liberation, control, and homogenization. And then finally, in order to understand space, gender, and sexuality all together, we rely mainly on the contribution of the geographies of sexualities and queer and feminist geographies. So these allow us to think of space as sexualized, as produced by the repetition of symbols, of practices, and representations. So it's also in these subfields of geography that some studies look at the links between LGBTQI+ identities and nightlife, as well as queer territories. Now, regarding the methodology, so we chose a qualitative ethnographical methodology and use several techniques such as the field diary, social photography and filming work, the participant observation, which took place in 3 clubs, so Hábitos and Passos Manuel and Zoom. So the 2 first one are LGBT-friendly clubs, and the Zoom is a gay club. So we chose these because in Porto there are no specific lesbian clubs, and yeah, these 3 spaces basically constitute important spaces for nighttime sociability of queer women and non-binary people. So, sorry. We also did 9 individual and semi-structured interviews that were conducted with participants with a variety of profiles, that be in terms of gender identity, sexual orientation, age, nationality, or even the role in space, since we have workers, we have consumers, we also have artists, photographers, DJs. Yes, and we need to add that although the participants present a certain heterogeneity in socio-demographic terms, should be noted that 8 of them are white, all of them are able-bodied, and a majority of them completed or are completing university studies. So all of these aspects imply a specific representation and experiences which shape the story that is told, as well as the way to tell the story. So we stress this in order to keep in mind that the plurality of experience exists, and to not show this perspective and representation as homogeneous or representative of all queer women and non-binary people. There was also an adaptation of the data collection technique due to the pandemic context, with the closure of the space studied halfway through the investigation. That resulted in that had a big impact on the participant observation as well as the filming work. And so this adaptation was reflected mainly on a greater focus on the interviews. Now regarding the data discussion, so we look at the data from 3 distinct angles, which allow for a different understandings of the clubbing experience, the body, the emotions, and the identity. So these elements first appeared in the literature and fieldwork. They appear to be of particular relevance to the clubbing experience of queer women and non-binary people. And although each of these allow specific elements of the experience to be brought to light, we can also see that they complete each other and they sometimes even overlap. So this section was inspired by the titles of Goffman's book, The Presentation of the Self, and it focuses on the way in which the body is presented in nighttime leisure. So we focus on the experience that the looks, the clothes, makeup, and ways of presenting oneself seem to have in the night. From that, we make the observation that there is a certain freedom and willingness to present a different aesthetics in the context of nighttime leisure. We can link that to the fact that the night constitutes a liminal space-time where norms are more blurred, they can be also more easily broken, changed, and reconstituted. And that provides the opportunity to present oneself in a way that breaks from daytime dress codes. So there is also the issue of work, which usually takes place during the day, that can partly explain the break in terms of day and night dress codes, as it may impose limitation in this respect. Perhaps there is also the question of the cultural affirmation, since the nightlife is made up of several scenes, and each scene is associated with a series of codes, practices, and identities that convey specific cultures. So another variation between day and night regarding the body lies in the posture, in the way of moving in space, in the body language, and in the movements that occupy more space. The night is conducive to exaltation, and this is expressed in a bodily manner. This can be observed in the dancing, in the interaction with other bodies. For example, we hug, we kiss, we touch more than in a daytime context, but that can also be seen in the noises that the body emits. So we talk more, we scream, we laugh. So we can say that at night the body has a different way of moving in space, as if it had a greater amplitude of movement, while at the same time, contradictorily, it often has less space. We can say that the sensoriality is reinforced, the music is loud, the vibrations can be felt, the personal space is reduced, and there is more contact between bodies, We can smell and taste drinks and cigarettes to our particular lights and colors. So the five senses are constantly activated and are sometimes also altered by the consumption of various psychoactive substances. Another observation is that the communication takes place in a different way, which is not so much based on words and speech, but on the corporal and sensory elements that characterize the space-time of clubbing. So the bodily liberation that we somehow observed in terms of the dress codes extends beyond this aspect, as it also encompasses movements and senses. And also we can say that dancing occupies a central place in the clubbing experience, and it was often described as a process that allows a bodily liberation through a focus on the body and its sensation. Now, we think of the clubbing experience as constituted by a vast repertoire of emotions, and as part of a process of liberation, both physical and emotional, which we can link to a break from diurnal identities. Anna, who works as a bartender and is also a consumer in these spaces, explains that it's in the clubbing that she can feel the closest to herself. And we have Viviana, another interviewee, who is also an artist and a consumer, that makes an observation along this line when she explains that that's the thing about the night. Traditional family sleeping, and so from midnight onwards, you can be whoever you want to be. We can also observe a different way of experiencing sociability in the context of urban nighttime leisure, which is reflected in a disposition or even a desire for contact, for encounters and discovering the other. There is overall a big rupture between the daytime urban space and the space-time of clubbing, and this rupture can be experienced at multiple levels, bodily, emotionally, and in identity. We can also say that coming into contact emotionally and physically with other individuals with marginal identities allows one to feel a sense of cohesion, a sense of belonging, as well as freeing oneself from certain views, norms, and oppressions for the duration of the night, and sometimes even more as this experience leaves its mark on the construction of the individual's identity. So these emotional spaces built from contact with other queer individuals allow for an exit from the condition of isolation that sometimes characterizes the experience of people who are outside of the sexual and gender norms, and that also presents possibilities of existence outside of these norms. However, we need to put into perspective these representations of the representation of the space of clubbing as a zone of freedom and inclusion. First of all, that is because it is also characterized by dynamics of exclusion. An example of that is the economic exclusion that conditions the very entry to the physical space, since none of these spaces are free. Another exclusion can be seen in the systematic absence of disabled people, and here we talk about people with visible disabilities, knowing that invisible disabilities also exist. Another important element that makes us put into perspective such representation is that the three spaces studied present many differences from other nightlife leisure spaces in the city of Porto. Therefore, we cannot extend all of the observations to other spaces, which are often perceived as uncomfortable or even hostile for many queer people. And besides that, even the spaces that are LGBT or LGBT friendly are not impervious to forms of control over certain bodies and are the site of conflicts regarding gender and sexual norms. And we argue that looking at these conflicts, discontinuities and ruptures can reveal certain relations of power and dominations, as well as tensions related to identity, and that's what we did in the observations. So most participants experienced and or observed these tensions to varying degrees. So from all the attitudes that the participants face, whether they've expressed discomfort, disgust, amusement, or even sometimes fetishization, they all constitute a way of perceiving the individual as an object, as something less human. What differs is only the feeling that the object generates in the eye of the observer. So what we can say is that here we are facing complex spaces that are embedded in power relations through which norms are constantly redefined. There is always the presence of attitudes and behaviors that are part of the reinforcement of the heterosexual imperative, of gender norms and of the representations, as well as the various oppressions that this can entail. We can also look at the effects of the presence of queer bodies, practices, and performativities produced. Not only does this allow for the contestation and recreation of gender and sexual norms, even if that happens sporadically and in a site-specific way, but it also gives visibility and normalizes these bodies and the interactions between them. So these presences and acts constitute an everyday negotiation of the space, as well as forms of resistance as taught by Foucault and Butler, which might not take the form of great revolutions, but nonetheless allow for the desensitization of relations of domination. So to conclude here, we can say that the articulation of the dimensions of space, gender, and sexuality allows us to understand the variation in the ways in which gender and sexuality can be expressed and experienced in certain spaces, as well as the ways in which these elements participate in the construction of space. And this could not have been done without looking at the club and at a larger scale, the city, beyond their material, static, tangible reality. And this allows us to perceive another reality which cannot be touched, but which is no less constitutive of the experience of space. Spatializing gender and sexuality, particularly from a queer perspective, has highlighted the ways in which spatial norms and traditional power structures are contested and destabilized as a result of practices that do not fit into the heterosexual imperative and the gender binary system that it upholds. In the space-time of clubbing, we can find challenges, struggle, transgressive acts that assume a political dimension and add to the multiplicity of meaning of the space. So the relative rupture from daytime normative identities that take place in the context of nighttime leisure activities can favor the expression and visibility of bodies and identities marginalized in daytime space. This produces certain effects such as the emergence of feelings of freedom, of cohesion, of belonging that play a role in the construction of identity. However, as it was observed, these effects need to be put into perspective as they are not a general rule of nightlife, not even of LGBT or LGBT-friendly clubs. And the specificity of this investigation is that it is situated between the observation, the experience of the spaces and their memory, between what is present and what is no longer present. But even through that particular position, it was possible to reveal certain aspects and dynamics intrinsic to the space-time of clubbing and its experience. The body, emotions, and identity triad allowed for the exploration of issues of control, inclusion, exclusion, conflict, and rupture, belonging, identification, and meaning-making. It also showed that these three elements are intrinsically linked. We also emphasize the need to think about the city through the prism of gender, sexuality, but also race, class, and other variables that make it possible to understand specific inequalities, discrimination, exclusion, violence, and to reveal many dynamics which often go unnoticed. So far from concluding this reflection on space, gender, and sexuality, the results of this investigation seek to instead stimulate and encourage possibilities for further research. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia, for your presentation. For me, it was very interesting to hear your study, not only because of the topic, because it's a topic that actually I'm interested in and together with colleagues, also with Manuel, Jordi, and also colleagues from Cosmica, we were also thinking about this. But also because I live in Porto and I know very well the places you talked about, so it was interesting to hear this. I forgot to say before passing the word to Agnes, I just forgot to say a few words about the etiquette of this panel. So each speaker has around 15 minutes to talk, and the questions will be made in the end after all the three panelists had the chance to present, and then we can have together, also with the audience, a more participative and wider discussion around the topic of gender and rights. So thank you, Alicia. And now I will give the word to Agnes, Agnes Jiménez, that he's in another time, and she just woke up to join us in this event. And Agnes, I will give you the word to present yourself and also the topic that bring you to us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to share my screen, and it's okay. You can see it. Okay. So hi everyone. Good afternoon. For me, good morning. First of all, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to be in this space, sharing with you these very interesting investigations. My name is Agnes Jiménez, and I studied communication and a master degree in communication and social change. I'm Mexican, and I currently live in Tijuana, in Mexico. So in this city, I'm doing a PhD research in cultural study with advances I'm going to present today. So I would like to start saying that what I'm going to present is a storytelling that I made especially for this conference, and I think it contains the necessary narrative to understand the phenomenon that I am investigating. So I recommend you to follow the reading of the words marked in red, and at the end I can share the link of this storytelling in case you would like to do a full read when the conference ends. So as the title of this story announces, the topic is about the violence and precariousness experienced during the pandemic by women working in informal and nighttime commerce. So I think that to tell the stories about all the inequalities in women's life, and especially about their productive work, has been never an easy task, even more in the middle of pandemic and complicated context as COVID. In this sense, my research work has faced this and other difficulties for understand the ways that this crisis has affected some women more than others in a singular and intense ways, which is the case of the protagonist of this research, self-employed workers in the modality of informal commerce who are part of a structurally precarious sector that in these pandemic times could not stop working. The pandemic arrived in Mexico causing a situation of surprise and emergency. Our government took an action plan that included confinement and social distancing as the main strategies to mitigate the virus more effectively. As I'll show, that put us in front of many social vulnerabilities. The COVID narratives that showed up were named as quédate en casa, stay at home, and the sana distancia, this social distancing as part of a new normality. This narrative, which in my opinion are euphemisms for health surveillance, have been shaping social relations through discourses that underlie profound inequalities. Stories of those who have experienced a lack of protection and precariousness in our societies. Women in a street situation, migrants, self-employed workers, and marginalized people by a system that doesn't allow them to enjoy public health services. Now, let's go through the theoretical lenses that is helping me to understand this phenomenon. I'm taking a feminist perspective to denounce the violence that emerged from a capitalist and heteropatriarchal and colonial order, and a sociological and phenomenological perspective of precarity, And finally, a social and cultural perspective of night study that shows the multiple, diverse, complex, and controversial social and symbolic uses of night. These historical lenses allows me to understand that this precariousness is not just increases labor uncertainties, but those of life itself. This precariousness is inserted in the microspaces of daily life and work trajectories and social practices that are determined by gender inequalities that have historically placed women in informal jobs or low-skilled jobs. Now to talk a little bit about Tijuana. Tijuana is located in northwestern Mexico. And to talk about this city, I chose this short video that I recorded, that it shows just one part on the city that I think that represents the terrible contrast that happens every day. As you know, Tijuana shares with United States the most crossed border in the world. Therefore, Tijuana is in a geographical and symbolic north because it has been a very important place for the development of the labor economy, driven by the maquiladora, the factory boom that started in the 70s that attract the cheapest Mexican labor. But to name it in a better way, the poorest and more vulnerable people of the south of the country and from Central America as well, who arrived looking for a better life. So the story of this city is the story of promises, dreams, and the ideas of a better life, whether on de este lado de la frontera o del otro, in this side of the border or the other, but it is also the story of a chaotic urban order, a sectorized and disconnected modernity. Today, Tijuana represents a contrast of realities. And now about the city nocturnality, Tijuana, I have to speak about Tijuana Leyenda Negra. It's the story of the beginning of the nightlife in the city that is related with the prohibition period that happened in the United States on the 20s, but it also related with the idea of the permissivity, the city where all wishes come true, wishes that need money to come true, wishes that need the Mexican workers to come true. But there is another narrative about the urban night that shows the emergence of imaginaries of fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability caused by territorialized violence. This is the case of drug traffic, sex trade, human traffic, and feminicide. This last crime being the cause of the death of 146 women in the first half of 2021. Now, downtown Tijuana, where this research takes place, located to the west of the city, where commercial activities are focused and trade by national tourism. Especially downtown is an area that reflects cross-border identity, where past and present coexist in the same spatiality. Liquor stores, old Mexican curios, drugstores, craft breweries, signature cuisine restaurants, and new vertical housing complexes give shape to the night gentrification signed by consumption, practices, and forms of asymmetrical sociability that are articulated on the streets. Tijuana downtown is characterized by the deployment of the nighttime economy, which also had made emerge a subaltern economy that is represented by the different ways of informal works. For Tijuana, COVID has been a health and economic pandemic that has created new problems for the regulated nightlife economy. At the same time, it has increased the problems of subordinated economies. For example, the dispute for public space and the persecution by state authorities in the name of economic and taxes control. Despite the massive lockdown of nighttime productive activities, business and services, many women couldn't stop going out to the street to seek economic sustenance. It happened in the middle of social desolation and a complete state of exception and emergency. And now to talk about a little bit more about this woman. Who are these women who sustain the city nighttime economy? Well, this is about 180,000 women to make up the large informal economic sector in the city. Although there is no statistical data of how many women make up the informal night trade sector, it is known that 50% of them are women on the 60s and over, who spend an average of 32 hours per week performing productive activities, generating an income of 22 pesos per hour, about $1 approx. They are women with low economic resources, without education. Sometimes they are migrants, mothers and grandmothers who seek the family income as part of a survival strategy that coexists with the reproductive task of their households. That means that they are forced to work double or triple shifts in a hyper-precarized and invisible conditions. On top of that, they are seen as out of place and assume the risk of experiences different kinds of violence. Now, to talk about a little bit of the methodology that I use is something that I call observación caminante. And it's a kind of walking observation, a wandering that seeks to approach women and their experiences from a physical, temporal, and spatial displacement. It is an observation that contemplates the urban landscape, the workplace, and other spaces of women's daily life where violence and precariousness emerge and are signified and also resisted by women. This walking observation is an encounter with other women and with their life trajectories that challenges the productive routines. Seeking Virginia Woolf, we can say that is why we walk, to take root, to create a space, a story, a language. We walk to remember, in other words, not to forget. So, to present an early findings of this research, I would like to name it as the new normality of old inequality. And to present these results, I want to keep the narratives in the original languages, because I want to let the woman speak by their own language and be heard by their own language. So I'll try to make my own explanation of this narrative. The first one, it says, is a sentence to say, gracias a Dios no paré. Thanks God, I didn't stop. And it says by a woman named Berenice, who sells newspapers. What we see in these sentences is the force of precariousness in certain of the woman life. I mean, it didn't matter that they were on a world lockdown that put in danger their own life. They assume it as an opportunity because they needed to be working on the streets. So in this other narrative, it speaks about the impossibility of home isolation and the neglect of the state. They are women without economic privileges and on the margins of the healthcare systems. And also economic effects due to the increase of up to 50% in basic food baskets products that it's necessary to eat and to prepare food that they sell every day. So this woman says that everything got very expensive, and she normally sells 60 tamales a day, but she couldn't, and she was making half of that, 30 tamales, and she was barely selling them. So she wanted to raise the price of the tamales 5 pesos, but because of the price of the corn went up. But they couldn't do that because she thought that people wouldn't buy them. So another observation is the specialization of fears. In this narrative, this woman says that it was scary to be on the street because it was lonely street, and she have to go quickly to deliver their orders and then back to her house. The first days of the pandemic, she didn't went out because she didn't know how things were going on the streets. But in the meantime, he had no choice to go out for herself. So this shows that the street and the night shows this specialization of fears, increasing fear sensation and loneliness. These feelings affect women's perception of these times and space. Another observation is about this state patriarchal surveillance and securitization of the city. And these two women speak about that they couldn't be on the street because they have this feeling that they were seen by the authorities that look for the sellers that doesn't have permissions to sell on the street. So they feel a lot of fear to be seen by these authorities, and there is a tension in this situation because women needs to be seen for they can sell their products, and in the same time she didn't want it to be seen because they were feared of these authorities. So they also speak about and it's also important to say that women always refer to the authorities in a masculine way that show these patriarchal orders in our societies. So another observation is about
Agnes?
social. Yeah,
Agnes, I'm sorry, I have to invite you to run to the conclusions.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, just say that these social stigmas and that derive from the presence on the streets, and also an observation that is important to be said that at the night it also allows freedom to women to can escape from the domestic violence and to feel free at night. So I just want to conclude that social research in pandemic time asks us to look critically at the process of social reconstruction that underline class pacts that exploit and precarize women whose work, paid or unpaid, sustains the world. This is why, as social researchers, we are called to reflect on mutual and collective care as a fundamental attitude to commitment to others. That means no matter what, we need to put life at the center. This means to act around social and economic justice and denounce the practice of domination that focuses on the dependence of capital, which excludes us when our lives are not profitable for it. So that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Agnes, thank you very much for your very much interesting presentation, and I'm sorry to interrupt you and inviting you to move to the conclusions, but we were rushing in time. I didn't have more time for you, but it was very interesting, your study, and you just share another vision and another perspective about gender negotiations and gender asymmetries at night, and it was quite interesting to hear from you. So thank you for joining us today. So, and finally, now we are moving to the third and last presentation we have today here, and just before the discussion moment we will have. So I think now we will have Abdallah Zouhairi. I'm sorry if I'm spelling it wrongly. And I join you. I invite you to join us here. Or Sana, who is the person who it's you, Sana?
Yeah, yeah, hello. Yes, it's
okay,
Abdallah Zouhairi. Yes.
Okay. So
nice to meet you all. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. And me and Professor Sana Benbellii, we are two sociologists from the Department of Sociology in Casablanca. And I am associate researcher, and she is a professor of sociology. Can you bear with me just to share the... Okay, a moment. Okay. Okay, anyway. Sana, can you share from you?
Okay.
And can you start sharing? Okay, thank you, Sana. So, okay, the city of Casablanca, where we starting this ethnographic research on the rooftops transformed into cafes in Casablanca. Just a short note about city of Casablanca is located in north of North Africa in Morocco. This is the economic capital of the country with about 4 million inhabitants. It is a city on the Atlantic Ocean that concentrates on several industrial and commercial activities. The history of Casablanca goes back quite a long way. However, during the French protectorate, the city took on its importance mainly because of its port, which is used for major commercial transaction with the whole world. This French presence has left an urban history of Casablanca that is still operating today. Indeed, the city has been separated into a modern European part and others reserved for the local population. In the city center of Casablanca, this European touch is still visible in the architecture and the continuity of an urban style that still exists. Some French urban planners also resorted to mass housing forms to absorb the indigenous populations who had to remain away from the European core. This dichotomy will be even more reinforced with time, or Casablanca will reproduce the center-periphery scheme to benefit the segmentation of modern gentrified versus famous districts, relatively varying between poor and middle-class populations. And the recent history of Casablanca, which can be dated from this French protectorate, is also a history of cultural and even recreational practices in the city. And the name of Casablanca itself is strongly linked, at least for a generation of film lovers, to the film Casablanca with Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. Indeed, the film does not describe the real Casablanca. However, it shows a possible nightlife or an exotic oriental setting bordering on fantasy mixes with European characters caught up in the relational logic of the Rick Café, which is now far removed from the famous authentic cafés of Casablanca districts. The image of Arab concierges in the Aladdin's trousers, palm trees, and whitewashed houses are no longer relevant. Oh, the image of Casablanca night will change a lot and will no longer remain in the calm and melancholic notes of the pianist Sam in the film Casablanca. If we look at the filmography that has partly dealt with this urban night in Casablanca, we notice that the night is more violent, passionate, and even vicious. In its economic boom, Casablanca has become an attraction for those who want to succeed and go out at night. The coastal area, where many hotels, nightclubs, and luxurious cafes are concentrated has long been a zone of pleasure, nightlife, and freedom. This image is produced and reproduced in these film narratives while revealing a class struggle that is never resolved despite access to their leisure spaces. Suppose Ingrid Bergman's nocturnal presence at the Rick Cafe is shown as a moment of passion, love, and regrets. In this case, the nocturnal presence of Moroccan women in films about Casablanca nights is a mixture of debauchery, vice, and revolt against social norms. The night is a virtual and spatio-temporal border for women. Crossing this boundary, going out at night, going to a cafe, a nightclub, or a bar is a sign of rupture with the group that produced this norm. The woman is, in this case, an object of forbidden desire, a naked body, a belly dancer, a prostitute, or a concubine. Her nocturnal status is constructed as an object of pleasure, a conquest, or a service to be purchased. This film image indeed finds contrast in reality, where women are increasingly escaping this representation, but to do so, these women need other capital, particularly cultural and social capital. A working class girl might easily fall into this image if a woman, as a woman object, if she finds herself in the middle of this Casablanca night. The problematic presence of women in the city's outdoor night space is also strongly associated with a gendered time when only men were allowed to be outside, following this social and cultural norm. Moreover, the lexical field tells about this norm when we hear, for example, the term night girls used euphemistically to refer to prostitutes. This spatio-temporal segmentation of gender is also related to an Arab heritage that has long emphasized the presence of women indoors. Although in many parts of the Arab world, women have been able to access the outside world, whether for employment, education, or even leisure, this access has remained diurnal. The literary imagination is also an indicator of this internal role of women, particularly as wives or even concubines. In the classic Arab account, the 1001 Nights, which is centered on this male domination of the night, Scheherazade must entertain the prince and count to him each night's story until the daybreak, at the risk of being killed if she does not do it correctly. Suppose Prince Shahryar, which is the prince, is lucky enough to live in a giant castle and spend his night listening to Shahrazade's beautiful tales. In the case of many men, they are not so lucky and are often obliged to share accommodation with other members of the family, especially women, mothers, sisters, wives, and mothers-in-law. In working class neighborhoods, the surface area of housing does not allow for private space or living quarters. So this intimate cohabitation, which often borders on promiscuity, is often resolved thanks to the outdoor space where men find refuge, particularly in the famous cafes of Casablanca. At night, in particular, the cafe makes it possible to spend time, and even a lot of time, away from home, left to women for whom this nocturnal space is socially prohibited. The cafe offers a space to pass the time, to smoke, to chat, or watch a football match, which could be impossible to do with the women of the family who prefer other programs. Unlike downtown or coastal areas, where we find, for example, the Rick Cafe, where Sam played the piano in the Casablanca movie, the famous cafes are closer to home. The popular cafes are so close to home, in the same alley or at most in the same neighborhood. The price of coffee is very affordable and does not exceed €1, for example. Sadly, the COVID-19 pandemic occurred as an emergency that caused the closure of all cafes in Casablanca day and night for several months. The social rhythm of many users of these cafes was disrupted. The outdoor space that served as an extension or even compensation of a female indoor space was suddenly closed. The confinement aggravated a feeling of being trapped, locked up, imprisoned in one's home. While the women were there in their usual spatial element, the men had to come back to negotiate a place within this inner living space where some used to come to eat and sleep only. it was men who invited themselves into women's inner space. The Casablanca night was no longer like the nightlife scenes in the modern and working class areas. Everything is closed. The only space left to appropriate and reappropriate, renegotiate and rediscover also is the home. Balconies, windows, rooftops, house threshold, and even building patios are being rediscovered. The legal boundary of confinement has been exploited to some extent, even pushed back to the limit by men wanting to find a confined interior and home suddenly commandeered during the confinement due to the pandemic. The urban planning of Casablanca, which developed during and after the French protectorate, favored mass or grouped dwelling that were intended to absorb the continuous flow of arrival to Casablanca. In most of Casablanca's working class neighborhood, this dwelling contains at least a rooftop, which is normally a feminine space. Rooftop as a liminal space between interior and exterior has been a topos described in some film or artistic narrative as a space of forbidden encounters between men and women. It is a space exposed to the outside as opposed to the house's interior, which is closed. It is customary for only women to use this space. Any male intrusion becomes subject to conflict, if not eroticization of the forbidden relationships, either visual or physical, between female and male bodies. In the wake of this exclusivity, women have appropriated the rooftops to carry out specific household tasks, especially the drying of clothes in the absence of washing machines or because of the lack of exposure to the sun in the houses. The rooftops can also be used for other purposes related to exposure to the air or the sun. In particular, the drying of meat, spices, or other foodstuffs on the occasion of specific traditional festivals. In these rooftops, men have sought to install space of extension of the home. This extension was made, however, as a kind of assault on a space generally reserved for women in standard time. Young men from these working class neighborhoods have transformed rooftops into a space that simulates the street cafe during the lockdown. Speaking about our method, we carried out indirect observation of rooftop cafes. The difficulty of being in a private rooftop during the lockdown meant that we collected online discussions in some Facebook groups where users were sharing pictures and discussions about their nocturnal practices in the rooftops. The illegal nature of gathering in the rooftops also meant that the men's, that's the men's discreetly held night meeting in a sort of private closed club where information circulated by word to mouth, phone, or private online communication. We were able to observe some rooftops during the day and where facilities and objects were left for the following night's meeting. It was also necessary for this man to rearrange the rooftop space to remove the clothesline in a symbol of total appropriation of the rooftop and the diversion of its feminine functionality. The men installed chairs, tables improvised with wooden boxes, and above all, an ashtray. Such objects complete the virile function of the rooftop as a place to smoke cigarettes with friends. The coffee as a product had to be as close as possible to the coffee served in the street cafe. The young people collected money to buy pressure machine, which is said to give a better coffee, but which in fact reproduce the sounds and the setting of a real cafe. This appropriation of rooftop space is thus made in an implicit bargain between women and men during the confinement and lockdown. Faced with the sudden onset of this pandemic, the actors, men and women under pressure, did not have time to delay too long this negotiation. Solution for social survival had to be found quickly for both men and women. Thank you.